Masechet Nedarim Daf Yod Bet. We're on Yod Aleph Amud Bet on the bottom. As an introduction to this stuff, we need to know a very important principle. The main formula for making a vow is you say, this bread is prohibited to me like a korban. That's the full formula, and that works by transferring the vow that made the animal prohibited to my intention of what I want to do with the bread, make it prohibited. Now this works because the korban, the animal, when it was born, it was a regular, fine, just regular animal that I could use. Once I make a vow, the way I make it into a sacrifice is I make a vow that this I take upon myself as a korban. I designate this animal as a korban. Because I make a korban through a vow, so when I say this bread will be like a korban, so I'm saying however I made this animal prohibited to me by making a korban, so too I want the same vow to apply to the bread. Not that the bread is going to be sacrificed, but rather that it's prohibited just like a korban is prohibited. That's the way it works. A korban is prohibited. That animal is prohibited from the time I designate it all the way until it is slaughtered, and then finally the blood is sprinkled on the mizbeach. After that point, depending on what kind of korban it is, if it's one that's eaten non-olah, and olah remains prohibited throughout because it's just all burnt. But if it's a shelamim or other types of korbanot that are eaten either by the kohanim or also by the owners, then from the point of the sprinkling of the blood and on, the korban is actually permitted. So whenever I say I make a vow, and I say this bread will be prohibited like a korban, the meaning is like a korban before you sprinkle the blood. All right, that's the principle. That's how a regular vow works. Here's the exception. If I say this bread will be prohibited to me like pig, that does not make a vow, because pig is prohibited to me by the Torah itself, not by a vow, but by a biblical prohibition. And therefore I cannot use that terminology in order to transfer the idea of one vow to another thing. That will not work. That is very important, and that will relate to the Mishnah the section of the Mishnah we're going to be talking about, which is tahor v'tameh notar upigul asur. If I say this bread will be prohibited to me like tahor, or like something tameh, what I mean is like a korban that's tahor or a korban that's tameh. Both of those effectuate a binding vow, because whether a korban is tahor or tameh, it still can't be eaten. Here's the problem. Notad and pigul, an animal that was sacrificed and now I was able to eat it, or Kohen was able to eat it, but now it passed the time, either 1 day or 2 days, depending on what kind of animal it is. The cutoff time, it's too late. It's past the due date and cannot be eaten anymore. The prohibition of notad is a biblical prohibition. And so this is not because of a vow, but rather because of basic biblical prohibition. And therefore it should be like saying this is prohibited like pig. Why does notad work? Same thing with pigul. Pigul means that the Kohen, when he was doing the slaughtering or one of the services, had in mind that he would eat it after the time that is permitted to eat. That also makes it prohibited, would be chayav karet if he actually did eat it. So that animal is also, after the sprinkling, both notad and pigul would be an animal that's finished sprinkling, so it's not prohibited because of the vow that I made when I donated it, but rather is prohibited because it passed the time, or he had intention to eat it past the time. So notad and pigul actually should be mutad if I say this is prohibited like notad and pigul. That's going to be the question that the Gemara is going to deal with. It's not going to deal with it directly, but rather through a different question, and this we'll answer this in the response. Rami Bar Chama asked. He's one of the sages that often asked questions about theoretical in-between paradoxes. So here's this interesting question. Hare alai kebasar zibche shelamim la'achar zirikat damim. Mahu. Someone says, this bread will be prohibited to me like the flesh of a shelamim offering after I sprinkled the blood. Now a shelamim is a kind of animal that after you sprinkle the blood is permitted to eat some to the Kohanim, and some to the owners. So actually, this is totally permitted. So if I say this is prohibited, this bread is prohibited, like a shilamim, after it's sprinkled, well, that sounds like I'm not making any vow at all, because that would be like saying, this bread will be prohibited to me like, this food here, that's permitted food. Well, how would that make a prohibition? So here's the details of his question. So now we say, first of all, if he actually said this exact language, then for surely it would not be a binding vow, because he is borrowing the language of something that's permitted. So for surely that would not be a binding vow. Rather, what Rami Bar Chama's question is on the following case. It's where he has an actual piece of shelamim offering in front of him that's permitted to him because it's already slaughtered and sprinkled, and it's right there. It's edible, it's totally kosher. And he takes some bread that's permitted bread and puts it next to it. And he says this bread will have the same status as this meat. That's what he's talking about. He doesn't say explicitly the whole formula. He just says this is like that. And the question is, when he says the bread is like the meat, does he mean the meat as it was in its earlier state before the blood was sprinkled? That is from the time I designated the korban until the blood is sprinkled. That was prohibited. Is that what I had in mind? Or do I have in mind the way it is now? And its current state is it's permitted to eat. In that case, when I said the bread will be like the meat, so I made no binding vow, and the bread is permitted. That's his question. Okay, so you see why we had to change it from saying this full language. If you actually said this full language, this bread is like a shelamim after I sprinkled the blood, well then that's permitted. But if I say it's like this meaning in its current state, or maybe I mean this in its prior state when it was prohibited, and then it would make a binding vow. That's Rami Bar Chama's question. Okay, Rava is going to relate this question to our Mishnah. That's why it's here. Amar Rava, Tashema, Notad, Upigul. He says, look at our Mishnah. It includes Notad and Pigul as two designations that will make a binding offering. If I say this bread will be like Notad. Now something can only become Notad or Pigul after the sprinkling of the blood. That's right, you're finished, and then you leave it, it's left over. Or you had it when you had the wrong thing in mind, and then he eats it after the sprinkling of the blood. So then that is prohibited. But it can only get the status of notad and pigul after the blood is sprinkled. And yet the Mishnah says it's prohibited. Why? In those two cases, it should only be prohibited because of notad and pigul, which are biblical prohibitions. And a vow will not transfer if I compare it to a biblical prohibition. If I say, this will be like pig, I said nothing. Therefore, why does the Mishnah say that this language works? It must mean that when I say this bread will be notad, it's not talking about the current state of the meat, which is notad, but rather the state that it was in beforehand. Before I sprinkled the blood, before it became notad, it was a regular korban, which is prohibited before the sprinkling of the blood. Also pigul, at some point beforehand, it was a regular prohibited sacrifice because of the vow of when I donated it. And so you see with notad and pigul, it's only prohibited because that designation refers to an earlier state when it was prohibited as a vow. And so too, that would be the answer to Rami Bar Chama's question. When he says, this will be like that, and he's pointing to the shelamim, he's referring to the prior state of that meat when it was prohibited. So that's his answer, Rava's answer of why it is prohibited. And that's right, you go to the earlier state. However, Amale Rav Huna Bered Rav Natan disagrees. Benotad Shel Olah. Hold on, the Mishnah doesn't designate exactly what type of korban it is. When it says notad, it could be that the Mishnah meant specifically a notad of an olah sacrifice. Now, an olah sacrifice is always prohibited by force of the vow. Once I designate an animal as an olah, that makes it prohibited because of that vow forever. Even after I sprinkle the blood, it's still, because it's an olah, prohibited to anyone to eat. And even if it becomes notad also, or pigul also, that just would be an added prohibition But it never could be in no matter what. So really, those whole concept of notad and pigul do not matter for an olah. Olah is always prohibited. So that's what it's talking about. If I say it's notad the notad of an olah, well, that was always prohibited as a vow. So in its current state, no matter when it is, even after the sprinkling of the blood, would still be prohibited because of the vow. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. Only that type. Okay, Rava responds, he defends himself. Then the Mishnah should have said, if it's a basad olah, and just talk about that case, and you don't have to talk about notad and pigul. If it's only talking about basad olah, then no matter what it is, so say that if I say this is like a basad olah, and the Mishnah should have mentioned that. So Rav Huna responds, Lami bayakama, says, you're right, in fact, the Mishnah was certainly including basad olah, but it wanted to teach us something else. Lami baya basad olah de asur. Of course, if I would designate something as this would be like basad olah, certainly that would be prohibited. Tabe korban kamat pis, because I'm saying this bread will be like a korban. That's prohibited by a vow, and it's prohibited by a vow the whole time. Notad pigul de olah istericha. But he needs to tell me that even if I say notad and pigul regarding an olah, then I might have thought perhaps it's not forbidden. Because it could be that one would think the language that if I say this bread is prohibited like notad of an olah, maybe what I mean is like the prohibition of notad or like the prohibition of pigul. Either I said the full formula, maybe I just said this is prohibited like notad, and the assumption is the notad of an olah. But if I just say that formula, then I don't know, it's not clear if I'm referring to the prohibition because of the olah. Maybe what person has in mind is this is prohibited like notad, but even of an olah because of the prohibition, the specific prohibition of notad, the specific prohibition of pigul. But in that case, those prohibitions themselves are prohibited from the Torah itself, and you cannot transfer the prohibition from a biblical prohibition to a vow. And it would not be kamash malan. That's why the Mishnah has to say notad and pigul, and not just olah, to teach me that chidush, that if I have in mind a korban olah, certainly if I just say this is like a korban olah, for sure it will be no good. But even if I say notad and pigul, with intention that it's an olah, that's still prohibited because the intention applies to its prohibited status as an olah, and not its prohibited status as pigul and notad. And therefore, he rejects Rava's answer. Okay, so that's the first attempted response to Rami Bar Chama's question. And now we'll come to a second one. The second one is introduced in an unusual way by Metibeh. Usually in most Masechtot, Metibeh is a challenge to what we came before. But literally the words Metibeh just means lehashiv, to respond. So this could be a response. In a way, it's an objection to the original question. Well, the original question was, is it this or that? So this is a response to the original question. So this is going to be response number 2. As says like this: Ezehu isar ha'amor b'Torah. When the Torah says lindor neder le'esor isar, so this is a prohibition. So what does that mean? How do you make a prohibition that's mentioned in the Torah? Amar hareni shelo ochal basar v'shelo eshte yayin kiyom shemet bo abiv. Someone says, I am not going to eat meat or drink wine, on this day or tomorrow, like the day when he says, like the day when his father died. This would be a common custom. People would fast on the day that their father dies, and on the Yortzeit. Many people still do this today. I think it's fallen much less in fashion today than it used to be. But even back then, people would either make a full fast. Here it's talking about, but he makes just a vow to abstain from wine and meat when their father died and on the Yortzeit. Now, a person says on a random day, he says, I am going to prohibit myself meat and wine like the day when my father died. So that would make a prohibition. Kiyom shemet bo rabo, or his teacher. People would also have abstain from meat and wine on the day that their teacher died. He says, on this day, I'm going to abstain like the day when my teacher died. Kiyom shenarag bo Gedalia ben Achikam, like the day when Gedalia was killed. This we have a fast, official fast day, Som Gedalia. But since that's only the Rabbanan, it is possible for a person to take upon himself a further vow that he's going to fast on that day. So if he says, I'm going to fast tomorrow, like the day of Som Gedalia. Also, when people would come and visit Jerusalem and they see it's destroyed, some people would take upon themselves a fast day. So if he says, listen, tomorrow I'm going to fast like the day when, a few months ago, I went to Yerushalayim and I saw it destroyed, and back then I took upon myself a vow for a fast. Tomorrow I'm going to make like that day. So all these make a valid binding vow. Shemuel qualifies this statement and says that's only if he actually abstained from meat and wine on that day. He actually had to make a vow on that day when his father died. That he would abstain, and then afterwards he can refer back to that day. Okay, we're going to give two interpretations of what Shemuel meant, but through this we're going to try to answer our question. Now, what is the case talking about? Let's say with the father's yortzeit. Lav kegon dekae behad b'Shabbat demit be'abu. It must be, let's say, it's talking about Sunday, and tomorrow is going to be Sunday, and that was the same day of the week when his father died. It was also a Sunday, and it's the same calendar day of the year of the yortzeit. Now, even though, since his father died maybe 10 years ago until now, even if he fasted every year, but it falls out on different days of the week. So even if there were many Sundays in which eating was permitted, because that was not the yortzeit, nevertheless, if I say tomorrow, Sunday, is going to be like going to not eat meat and drink wine like the day his father was born, father died, that is binding. Why? Because it means the vow doesn't go to the previous Sunday or the Sunday the year before or anything like that. It goes back to the Sunday when he first made the vow. So you see that when someone makes a vow, it doesn't go by the latest status of that type of day, but rather to the original status of that type of day. And therefore that answers the question of Rami Bar Chama. Also, when a person says this will be like the meat, that's over here, it means the meat in its prior status when it was prohibited. So this would be an answer to the question. Of course, it depends on interpreting Shemuel that particular day means a particular day of the week. Which doesn't sound like what Shemuel actually meant. And so therefore we actually reject this and say, no, this Shemuel hachi itmar, amar Shemuel v'hu shenadur uba me'ato hayom ve'elach. Shemuel's qualification is only that he made the vow from that day forward that every year he would abstain. If he only abstained 1 year or 2 years, and then in the next 8 years he didn't, well then that's a problem because he's making a vow and it would not go back to the first one. But if it's a regular pattern that he does it every year and then he says, listen, tomorrow, whatever day it is, I'm going to make it like the day of my father's yortzeit, that would make a binding vow. That's all Shemuel meant. But it actually does not mean that you go back to an earlier status. It just means you go to the regular status, that he does something in an ongoing, continuous manner. So that answer is rejected. And now we're going to get to the third and final solution to the question, when we make a vow that this will be like that, do we go by the current status or by the prior status? Amar Ravina, Tashema. Kechalat Aharon uchtirumato mutar. This is a Mishnah that's coming out on tomorrow's daf. And it says, if I say this bread here, that's permitted bread, is going to be prohibited to me like challah of Aharon. So that's the challah, the part whenever you're making a big dough. Till today we do this. You separate off some and you give it to the kohen. That's prohibited to most people. And so if I say this bread is going to be like challah, So that does not make it prohibited. Why? Because challah is prohibited from the Torah to a non-kohen, and not because of a vow. And so this would be same as saying this prohibited to me like pig. Doesn't work. That's a biblical prohibition. I can only copy language of a vow. If I say it's like his tirumah, like Aharon's tirumah, also that will not make a binding vow, because tirumah, the section of produce, the part of produce that I give to the kohen, that's a biblical prohibition. It's not because of a vow, as I don't vow that I'm going to give this to the kohen. I just separate it and I say will be tirumah, and then it has the status of tirumah, right? And I have to give it to the kohen. I'm prohibited to it. So therefore, this does not make a binding vow. All right, that is what the Mishnah says. And Ravina is going to make an inference from this. Since it only says kitrumato, it doesn't say tirumah like any tirumah. Sounds like it's talking about only tirumah on grain that I give. Kitrumat lachme todah asur. But there is another kind of tirumah. There's lots of different kinds of tirumah, things that are given to the kohen. And one of them is lachme todah. If someone brings an animal sacrifice as a korban todah, so that part of it is an animal, but that comes along with 40 loaves, 10 of chametz bread, and 10 each of different kinds of non-leavened bread. Some of it is matzot, wafers, boiled boiled loaves. So 10 chametz, 30 of them. Not chametz, 4 different kinds, 10 of each. Those are called lachme todah. Now there's another step. You have not just lachme todah, but tirumat lachme todah. Once you have those 40 loaves, you have to take one of each type of loaf, so 4 altogether, one of chametz, one of the matzah, one of the wafer, one of the boiled ones, and give it to a kohen. So that's tirumah of lachme todah. Now, when do you do this designation that you would give it to a kohen? Well, here's how it works. You bake these chalot before the animal is sacrificed, and you have them ready. Then you're going to designate them that these will be used for lachme todah. You have to designate them. That's by a vow. So this does work by a vow. And then you do shechita on the animal, and they become then associated with the animal. Once you sprinkle the blood of the animal, then the 40 loaves become permitted to eat. Anyone can eat them. The owner eats them. But he has to give one of each to the kohen. Now, the one that gives to a kohen is prohibited for a non-kohen to eat. So that's the prohibition that we're talking about. Kitrumat lachme todah. If a person comes and says, this loaf, regular loaf, is going to be like the tirumah that's given from the lachme todah, one of 10, of each kind, 4 out of 40, then we can infer from this Mishnah that would make a binding vow, because this Mishnah doesn't mention it. Mishnah says, it talks about tirumato is mutar, but this type of tirumah of lachme todah is asur. Now, why is it prohibited? At this point in time, when I'm actually separating it, the 40 loaves are actually permitted. The vow is gone. Once I sprinkle the blood, then the prohibition that was made by sanctifying them they still are lachme todah, but now they're permitted to. There is no prohibition on them from the vow. So the only prohibition is that of the fact that it belongs to a kohen, and so I cannot have it. So therefore, it can't be that when I make this type of vow, this bread will be like the tirumat lachme todah. It's not going on the current prohibition, which is a biblical prohibition, but rather it's referring to its former status, that once upon a time, each of these 4 loaves that I gave to the kohen were part of the 40 loaves that before the sprinkling of the blood were prohibited. So Ravina is learning from here that, yes, indeed, when you say a language, you go by the previous status, and so too with Rami Bar Chama's question regarding the Shelamim, I'm going to go by the prior status before the blood was sprinkled. That's his proof. Right, here it is. Right, that's his proof that the tirumah lachme todah is generally separated after the sprinkling of the blood. So therefore, the vow goes by its former status. All right, is this a good proof? Well, not necessarily. Ema kitrumat halishka asur. This whole proof was based on an inference that the Mishnah only mentions chalat aharon and tirumato. So we said terumato is referring to the specific type of terumah of grain that you give to the kohen. And in that case, it will be mutar because there's no vow involved. So this comes to exclude another case. Ravina assumed it was excluding terumat tachmei todah, but not necessarily. Maybe it's excluding Tirumat halishka, that's asur. That's another kind of tirumah, when someone takes the machasita shekel and donates it to the Bet HaMikdash. That is a vow. And therefore, if someone says this bread will be prohibited like machasita shekel that is given, well, that is in fact forbidden. You can't take machasita shekel. You can't use it once it's separated and declared and made holy. And so maybe it's referring to that is the exception, and it's not talking about lachmei todah. And then your proof falls away. Well, we say, hold on, aval terumat lachmei todah mai mutar. So, okay, what is the status of this 4 loaves that I give to the kohen of lachmei todah? You're going to say todah. If I say this bread here is like that, then it doesn't make a binding vow. Is that what you mean to say? Because I go by the current status, and the current status is they are permitted to eat. It's only because I gave it to the kohen, which is not a vow. That's why it's prohibited, and so therefore since there's no vow, it will not make my other bread here prohibited. If so, then the Mishnah should have mentioned this case rather than tirumato, because lachmei todah once upon a time was a vow, and but now after the sprinkling of the blood, it's permitted, and now it's only prohibited because I gave it to the kohen and belongs to him. So write that case and say that's permitted, and then for sure I would know that regular terumah from grain that I give to him, which never had a problem of a vow, certainly would not make it prohibited if I use it in the language of a vow. So if it's permitted, then the Mishnah should have mentioned that first. Hakamash malan tirumat lachmei todah tirumato hi. Well, no, we can reject that because actually maybe when the Mishnah says tirumato, it's referring to in fact this exact type of tirumato, the tirumah of Aharon, or of a kohen, is referring also to tirumat lachmei todah, and so therefore this objection falls away, and we end up rejecting Ravina's answer because while he made the inference that it says tirumato, and that was mutar, that means terumat lachmei todah is asur, but that's not necessarily so. It could be that the word terumato includes terumat lachmei todah, and if I say terumat lachmei todah, in fact, this bread would be like lachmei todah, terumat lachmei todah. In fact, the bread would remain permitted. The vow would not be binding because there is currently no status of a vow on that bread. Okay, so that's all one response to Ravina. But here's another response to Ravina. In fact, if a person says Tirumat lachmei todah, there is a case where one could make such a vow before the sprinkling of the blood. Here, when we first questioned him, we assumed that it was in Avina's statement, in his proof, he was assuming that Tirumat lachmei todah, the 40 loaves, is separated, has to be separated after the sprinkling of the blood, meaning after there's no more prohibition of a vow on it. That was the basis of his proof. But now we're going to undermine the very basis of that proof, and so this is a second rejection of Ravina. So how could it be that I would separate these 4 loaves before the sprinkling of the blood? It could be if I'm kneading the doughs. I have the 4 different types of dough, and I'm kneading it, and I can separate one piece of dough, and I'll bake it separately. But from the time now that I'm kneading it, I say this will be the 1 out of 10 of this type of dough that I'm going to give to the kohen, and I do that for 4 different doughs, and I'll give the kohen eventually after I bake bake them or fry them, I will give it to the Kohen. And so that is certainly before the Zerikat Adam. It has to be, because the bread has to already be baked before the Shechita of the animal. So there you go. So that's maybe what the case is talking about. That's why the Mishnah doesn't include it. In fact, Terumat Lachmei Todah would be prohibited, would make a prohibited vow, because in their current state, before the sprinkling, they are prohibited by a vow. Right? I took this dough and I already designated by a vow that this dough is going to be for Lachmei Todah. Now we're going to prove that, in fact, I can do this process beforehand and even separate it as terumah for the Kohen, even while still dough. Ki hada amar Rav Tubi bar Kisna amar Shemuel Lachmei Todah she'afa'an be'arba chalot yasa. If someone wants, instead of making 40 loaves, he wants to just make 4 really big loaves, right? The point of the 40 loaves is that there should be a lot of bread, more bread than I can eat myself in a short time of the cutoff time of Korban Todah, of a day and a night. And therefore, because I have so much, I'm going to have to share it with friends and family and poor people, right? That's why I have to have a lot of dough. But what if it's the same amount of dough, but instead of 10 loaves, I want to make one really big loaf, of one of each kind, so 4 big loaves, 1 chametz, and the other 4 different types of matzot. Can I do that? Yes, Shemuel says it's permitted. Hold on, we ask. But doesn't it say 40? That's the mitzvah. That's the mitzvah mupabuchad. The best way to do it is to have 40. That way you throw them around, and everybody shares. But if you want to make one big, it's the amount that counts, not the exact number. Now, hold on. If you have one big loaf, how could you possibly give 1 out of 10 to the Kohen, 1 out of 10 of each kind to the Kohen? Maybe you'll say, I know, I have 4. I'll just give 1 big one to the Kohen, and that'll be, I'm giving actually more than a tenth, I'm giving a quarter, but I'm going to give 1, and then I will eat the rest. I'll give him extra. So maybe you'll say you could do that. No, you can't do that. No, it says you have to give 1 of each type. You can't give 2 matzot, 2 chametz ones, and that'll be for the wafer one. No, you have to give 1 of each type. So I can't just give them 1 big loaf of the boiled type, and that'll be for the rest. So it doesn't work. And if you say, after I bake it, then I'll just take a slice, a tenth of it, and give it Kohen a tenth of this big loaf, a tenth of the next big loaf, a tenth of each of the loaves. That's also not good, because Mishnah says 1, right? It has to be a whole loaf, shelo yitol perusa, that I can't give him a slice. So, how am I going to possibly make 4 big loaves? And the final answer is I can do it by separating it while it's still dough. דשקל חדה מחמץ וחדה מן חלות וחדה מן רקיקים וחדה מן רבוחה. So I have these 4 loaves, these 4 doughs, and while it's still dough, I take one of them that will eventually be chametz, one of them that's meant for the loaves that are matzah, one of them for the wafers, and one of them for the ones that will be boiled, and then I separate the dough. Then I bake those 4 parts that I separated, that I already designated, will be to the Kohen, and the other ones will be the big loaves, which is 9/10 of the whole dough, and that I'm going to bake as 1 big loaf. So here, the order of operations is, I have these loaves, I have the dough, I already say this dough will be for Lachmei Todah. So it's already vowed and therefore consecrated and therefore prohibited to everyone at that point. At that point, I separate some of it, and so that separate part is now going eventually to be terumah. Right now, at that point, if I say this apple is going to be prohibited to me like terumat lachmei todah, these here that are dough, and therefore are still prohibited because this is all before the sprinkling of the blood. Well, then that certainly would make a vow and a current vow. It doesn't have to go back to an earlier status, and therefore there is no proof from this case, even if the Mishnah was coming to that said terumat mutar was coming to exclude terumat lachmei todah. Nevertheless, it's not necessarily talking about something that happened earlier. It could be currently in that state. And so this is a second way of rejecting the opinion, the answer of Ravina. So in sum, we start off with the question of Rami Bar Chama about if someone makes a vow, has a piece of shilamim, permitted piece of shilamim right here, and he says this bread will be like the shilamim, then does that either not make a vow because the shilamim is permitted, or do we say it does make a vow because it'll go by an earlier status? We had 3 attempts to prove that yes, you go to an earlier status, but each of them were rejected. And on tomorrow's daf, we're going to attempt to say that the 2 possibilities of whether you go to an earlier time or the current time when it once upon a time was a vow, or currently when there's no vow prohibition on it, may be parallel to a machloket tanaim. Baruch Adonai leolam, amen v'amen.